what is veganism exactly? What are the reasons that lead people to consider going vegan? I'm not going to get into every issue or every question that people who may be new to the topic might have about veganism generally, but if you are new to the topic and you have an open mind and you stay with me for the next 30 minutes, I hope you'll come away with a good understanding of what veganism is and why so many people, myself included, feel that it's an important topic for public discourse, and that you'll come away maybe thinking a little differently about our relationship with non-human animals and some of the other important aspects from an environmental, human health, and even human rights perspective. So let's get started on vegan basics. First, what do we mean by the term vegan or veganism? The term was actually coined in the 1940s by a man named Donald Watson of the Vegan Society of the UK. I think he defined the term well. He defined it as a way of living that seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, and any other purpose. This means when it comes to animals, to the extent possible, you do not eat them, you don't wear them, and you don't use them for entertainment or any other purpose. It's a moral position that maintains that non-human animals are more than just things, not property or commodities simply to be used as a means to human ends. For anyone out there who's ever had a dog or a cat that you've connected with and who's been a part of your life or even a part of your family, you know that your dog or your cat is a someone with a distinct personality and with feelings. So to simplify this basic idea, or to put it another way, being vegan means if you wouldn't harm a dog or a cat, then you wouldn't want to harm a cow, a chicken, goat, pig, or any other animal, or pay someone else to do it on your behalf. And in many ways, it really is that simple. It's putting into practice the idea that we shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily. And I'll come back to discuss kind of these philosophical underpinnings of veganism and also discuss some of the environmental and human rights dimensions as well. But for a moment, let's step back and talk a little bit about diet and some basic nutritional information. So veganism, just to be clear, it's not a diet, it's a way of living. But this way of living certainly affects the foods that you choose to consume. For example, if I have a choice between buying a leather wallet or a wallet made from some non-animal material, I would choose the non-leather wallet over the leather wallet. And it's similar when it comes to food choice. If I have a choice between buying, for example, a beef hamburger or a veggie burger, I would choose the veggie burger. So in this way, when it comes to food, it means you choose not to consume or participate in increasing the demand for foods like meat, fish, poultry, dairy, eggs, honey, or any other animal or animal byproducts. And if you're like I was some years ago, or like most people in our present society, eating animal foods is probably a regular part of your habit, your daily routine, your diet, part of what you consider to be a main staple of your way of eating and the norm. And the idea for many people, when they first think or are introduced to this idea of eliminating all animal foods from your diet, it may seem like an extreme or daunting prospect at first, but from the other side of the process, there is some good news. It's actually not. It's in fact very easy to eat vegan once you form a few new habits. And there's actually even better news from just a basic nutritional perspective. Eating a completely vegan diet, eliminating animal foods, is actually also very, very healthy. Some exceptions to that, of course, if you're on a 100% beer and potato chips diet that happens to be vegan, that's not healthy, but that's not what we're talking about. A normal, sensible, balanced vegan diet with a variety of the usual vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, etc. That way of eating with no animal foods is very healthy. And even though there's a lot of confusion, I think, out there in the world of nutritional information, the one takeaway for purposes of going through vegan basics and just a foundation of the nutritional information that I think is the main takeaway is that it's not controversial within mainstream medicine and nutrition that we humans do not have any biological need to eat animal foods. For example, the official position of the very conservative Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, it's the largest organization of food and nutrition professionals in the country. Their official position is that appropriate planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, may provide benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases, and are appropriate for individuals during all stages of their life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and for athletes. And there's not one of the Academy's international counterparts or other mainstream nutritional authority that has any position to the contrary. And also, as noted by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, the major killers of Americans, heart disease, cancer, and stroke, have dramatically lower incidence among people consuming plant-based diets, and weight problems as well, a contributor to a host of other health concerns, including diabetes, can also be brought under control with a healthy vegan diet. And it does bear mentioning, even though it's implied by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, we do seem in this country to have an obsession with one nutrient in particular, protein. It's worth mentioning plants do have plenty of protein. Just as a somewhat tired old example, broccoli actually has more protein per calorie than beef. Of course, broccoli also has a lot fewer calories, but that's another benefit to eating that way. If you're trying to maintain a healthy weight and BMI, it fills you up. It's full of fiber and provides important nutrients, antioxidants, and other things that aren't found in animal foods. But the point is, eating a completely vegan plant-based diet is nutritionally adequate and it's very healthy. I'd like to just briefly play a quick clip from Dr. Michael Greger. He's a physician specializing in clinical nutrition, and he has a nonprofit website that's a great resource called nutritionfacts.org. So if we go ahead and play that clip real quick.
The largest study in history of those eating plant-based diets recently compared the nutrient profiles of about 30,000 non-vegetarians to 20,000 vegetarians, and about 5,000 vegans, flexitarians, and no meat except fish eaters, allowing us to finally put to rest the perennial question, do vegetarians get enough protein? The average requirement is 42 grams of protein a day. Non-vegetarians get way more than they need, and so does everyone else. On average, vegetarians and vegans get 70% more protein than they need every day. Plant-derived diets tend to contribute significantly less fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, foodborne pathogens, while at the same time offering more fiber, folate, vitamin C, phytochemicals, all essential factors for disease prevention and optimal health and well-being. And the more plant foods, the better. Whole plant foods, the better. If you compare the nutritional quality of vegan versus vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, and omnivorous diets, traditional healthy diet indexing systems, like compliance with the dietary guidelines, consistently indicate the most plant-based diet as the most healthy one.
Okay, so that's Dr. Michael Greger of Nutrition Facts. I think the main point, really, that I wanted to get across for purposes of providing a broad overview on this topic, is that when it comes to diet and nutrition, it's not controversial that animal foods are not required for human health. We can live without them. In fact, we're healthier without them, and certainly more and more mainstream physicians and medical authorities are warning us of the detrimental health effects that animal foods have, and certainly a mass shift away from animal foods would have a substantial positive impact on public health and the environment, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But again, the important point before we move on is simply that it's not necessary to eat animal foods. And with that in mind, let's turn back to the philosophy behind veganism, the idea of excluding, where we can, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals. To put another way, if it's a basic principle that most people already agree with, the idea that we shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily, I think most people, at least in theory, non-vegans and vegans alike, have this basic moral principle that if you don't have to hurt an animal, why would you? And I think most people already agree with that. And I think we we agree with that broadly because we understand that animals, again, are more than mere things. Even if we choose not to think about it, we know that cows and pigs, fishes even, and chicken, other animals that we use for food and for other purposes, each one is a complex and sentient animal. And in no morally relevant way are they any different from the dogs and cats with whom we bond and consider, in many cases, to be parts of our families. So intuitively and scientifically, we know that these animals all have the capacity to experience pain and to suffer. And most of us agree, again, with that basic idea that we ought not to harm or inflict pain and suffering on animals unnecessarily. The problem is that's exactly what we are doing as a society, and we do it at a staggering scale. Just with respect to food, which comprises the vast majority of our society's use of animals, worldwide, we kill approximately 65 billion land animals and up to 2.7 trillion marine animals every single year for food that, again, we have no biological need to consume. And here's where it comes together, I think, for the vast majority of our animal use. Once we familiarize ourselves with some of the basics of nutrition, and in that regard, once we understand or acknowledge the idea that we medically and nutritionally don't need to eat any animal foods, then we have a problem, because what justification is left for our paying for and supporting the killing of so many animals? You're left with maybe convenience. It's something you're used to doing. It's available. It's ubiquitous. Old habits, tradition, pleasure. You enjoy the taste. But we know that producing animal foods, whether meat, seafood, dairy, eggs, in any of these instances, producing these foods necessarily involves suffering and killing of animals. But if we take that basic idea that most people, I think, already agree with, that we should avoid harming animals unnecessarily, if that means anything at all, at the very least, I think it must mean that we cannot morally justify harming and killing animals for purposes of mere pleasure, convenience, or habit. And I think this is what scholars like Rutgers law professor Gary Francione mean when they refer to veganism as the moral baseline. The way Professor Francione puts it, if we regard non-human animals as having any moral value at all, i.e. they're more than just things, and we agree that morally we have some level, whatever it is, some level of obligation to take into account their interests, their desire not to be subjected to suffering, then at a minimum we cannot justify using and killing them for mere pleasure, amusement, convenience, habit, etc. Because if those mean it's necessary, then necessary really doesn't mean anything at all if we accept the principle, again, that we should avoid harming animals unnecessarily. So I'd like to play one more clip. It's actually from an interview that someone did with Professor Gary Francione discussing this very point, and we can hear the way that he puts it.
The predicate for veganism is already set. Most of us already accept all of the moral views that are the predicate for becoming a vegan. We all believe it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. All right? So now the next question becomes, what do we mean by necessity? Well, whatever it means, whatever abstract meaning it has, if it has any meaning whatsoever, its minimal meaning has to be that it's wrong to inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Because if it's all right to inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience, then you've got a loophole that's now so large you could drive a truck through it. So if the moral notion that we all accept, if that has any meaning, then it's got to be the case that we can't inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Okay. Problem is, 99.9999999% of our animal use can only be justified by reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. It's got to go. If we mean what we say, we have no choice. Veganism is the only rational, logical response to accepting that it is morally wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. When you explain it to people this way, people say, well, gee, I understand that. I'm not sure, I don't know. I don't know that I'm going to become a vegan or not yet. But you've got me thinking.
So that's Professor Gary Francione and his summary of the basic premise that we ought not to inflict harm on animals unnecessarily. We need a good reason, and pleasure, convenience, habit, these are not morally sufficient reasons to justify the type of harm that we inflict on animals for things like food and clothing. But one thing that comes up, and this has come up before, where people for ethical reasons will go vegetarian. They don't necessarily go vegan, they go vegetarian. It relates primarily to eggs and dairy, and this idea that, well, I agree we shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily, but chickens lay eggs anyway and cows produce milk anyway, so I can have eggs and I can have milk and not hurt animals. And I think that's really just an information gap. So just briefly wanted to note just a little bit about eggs and dairy. So it's worth noting that the animals that are raised for dairy and eggs, they not only endure horrific suffering, they also, every single one of them, are killed and at the slaughterhouse at a fraction of their natural lifespans. For the females in particular, when their egg or dairy production falls and they're no longer of economic value. And this is true no matter what the label, if it's humane eggs, free-range eggs, grass-fed dairy, cage-free this or that, they all go to the slaughterhouse when they are no longer of economic value, which is a fraction of their natural lifespans. And just with regard to dairy, it's important to also note, to produce milk, like any other mammal, dairy cows and other animals who are used for their milk, like goats, they have to be continuously impregnated year after year. This results in an excess of calves that the dairy industry can't use, and the calves are taken from their mothers usually within hours of being born, and that causes immense suffering and distress to both the mother and her newborn baby calf. The male calves never produce milk, so they're often sold by the dairy farms for veal, where they're typically sent to the slaughterhouse within just a few weeks of confinement. The female calves are either used for the next generation of milk producers, or they suffer the same fate as their brothers if they're surplus. And the dairy cows themselves are ultimately killed too when their milk production declines, which again occurs at a fraction of their natural lifespan. Usually after 4 or 5 years, cows can live up to 25 years. With regard to eggs, 1/2 of the chicks who are bred in hatcheries for egg-laying breed of chicken are male. And they're also a byproduct, and they will never lay eggs, and they have not been bred to grow fast enough to be considered economically viable for their meat. So they're considered worthless, and they're disposed of by the millions, most commonly by either being ground up alive or dumped into plastic bags to suffocate and die. And as with the spent dairy cows, when a female hen's egg production declines, she's also sent to slaughter at a fraction of her natural lifespan for poultry meat. So this is just a brief footnote, just because the question comes up quite a bit. Why eliminate eggs and dairy when it comes to the dietary side of things? And it's because there's really, once you look at what's necessarily involved to produce eggs and to produce dairy, there really is no morally coherent distinction between meat and dairy and eggs. It all involves death, suffering, and just horrible treatment of the animals. I do want to briefly touch on 2 other important and problematic aspects that are related to our use of animals for food, one being environmental, the other being some human rights issues. So as it relates to our planet and the global environmental challenges that we currently face, there's now broad scientific consensus that the livestock industry is an unprecedented environmental disaster of huge proportions. Just as an example, the United Nations FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, they've reported that raising animals for food is responsible for more human-caused greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector combined, and may well be the leading player in the reduction of biodiversity, since it's also the major driver of deforestation, as well as one of the leading drivers of land degradation, pollution, climate change, overfishing, among other serious global environmental issues. The scale and scope of the environmental problems associated with animal agriculture is really a topic unto itself, and we could literally spend the entirety of numerous shows exploring the various issues that are involved. But just for this brief overview, to provide a little bit of color on the environmental issues, I want to play an excerpt of Kip Anderson from the documentary Cowspiracy.
This means that raising cattle produces more greenhouse gases than all cars, trucks, trains, boats, planes combined. This is because cows produce a substantial amount of methane from their digestive process. Methane gas from livestock is 25 to 100 times more destructive than carbon dioxide from vehicles. I found out that 1/4 pound hamburger requires over 660 gallons of water to produce. Here I've been taking these short showers trying to save water, and to find out just eating one hamburger is the equivalent of showering 2 entire months. In 2009, 2 advisors from the World Bank released an analysis on human-induced greenhouse gases, finding that animal agriculture was responsible not for 18%, as the UN stated, but was actually 51% of all greenhouse gases. 51%. Yet all we hear about is burning fossil fuels. This devastating figure is due to clear-cutting rainforests for grazing, respiration, and all the waste animals produce. This makes animal agriculture the #1 contributor to human-caused climate change. But not only that, I found out raising animals for food consumes 1/3 of all the planet's fresh water, occupies up to 45% of the Earth's land, is responsible for up to 91% of Amazon destruction, is a leading cause of species extinction, ocean dead zones, and habitat destruction. 3/4 of the world's fisheries are overexploited, fully exploited, or significantly depleted due to overfishing.
The oceans are under siege like never before, and marine environments are in trouble. And if we don't wake up and do something about it, we're going to see fishless oceans by the year 2048. That's the prediction from scientists.
Okay, so that's an excerpt from the eye-opening film Cowspiracy. I'll provide some resources and suggestions towards the end of the show, but Cowspiracy is one of the few all-encompassing, I think, summaries of the environmental implications of our raising and killing animals for food. We don't really think about it. I mean, if there's, the human population, I can't remember exactly, but I think it took all of human history to get up to 1 billion people in the early 1800s, and here we are 2016. I think we're up to 7.3 billion humans, and we're projected to hit 9 billion and then 12 billion maybe by the end of the century. And if each and every one of these individuals, each and every one of us wants to eat eggs and meat and dairy and animal foods, the implications with respect to land use, water use, food security are enormous. And all of the environmental issues that are the most dire that we currently face, whether it's global warming, food security, fresh water security, none of them can be, according to the scientists, adequately addressed in a timely fashion without also addressing our dietary choices. So it's another dimension that I think emphasizes the importance of vegan issues in the public realm, and why it's an important topic for public discourse. It's a very, very important topic from an environmental perspective. And it's also an important topic from a human rights perspective as well. There's actually a number of important human rights related aspects to veganism, and I definitely cannot cover them all in the time we have on one show, but one of the most important aspects, in my opinion, is world hunger and how that relates to our food choices. So animals, they're very resource intensive. It's not just the animals, it's all the food that has to be grown to feed the animals, it's all the waste that's produced by the animals. But in addition to all of that, animals are extremely inefficient converters of food. And what I mean by that is the animals we raise for food themselves eat much more food than they produce. Animal foods like meat, dairy, and eggs, they're highly resource intensive. They require, like I said, much more food, land, water, energy than would be the case for eating plant foods directly. And animal-based foods, in this respect, they're a form of overconsumption and redistribution that reduces the amount of available global food and increases the price of basic food staples that poorer countries desperately need. And it's also worth noting that fishing is no longer globally sustainable either, and that was touched on as well in the excerpt we just played from Cowspiracy. As demand for fish has increased globally with our population booming and a shift away, in some instances, from land-based animal foods to aquatic animal foods, the loss of ocean biodiversity as a result of these trends has been accelerating at an alarming rate, with 29% of seafood species humans consume having already crashed. And if the current trends continue, this was also mentioned in the clip we just played, scientists, I believe from a study out of Dalhousie University, warn there will be little to no seafood left in our oceans by as early as 2048. I'd like to play one other clip from Cowspiracy that touches more on not just the environmental issues, but also the world hunger and human rights aspects of our dietary choices. So we'll see if we can play that.
We're growing enough food right now in the world to feed between 12 and 15 billion people. We only have 7 billion people. We have roughly 1 billion people starving every single day. Worldwide, 50% of the grain and legumes that we're growing, we're feeding to animals. So they're eating huge amounts of grain and legumes. And in the United States, it's more like closer to 70, 80, depending on which grain it is, about 90% of the soybean.
82% of the world's starving children live in countries where food is fed to animals in the livestock systems that are then killed and eaten by more well-off individuals in developed countries.
And that was Will Tuttle and then Dr. Richard Oppenlander talking about the implications of our dietary choices. Like I said, there's currently 7-point-something billion people on the planet. And I forget if it was Will Tuttle or Richard Oppenlander in the clip we just played, but we do currently grow enough food, plant food, to feed 10 billion or so people, which is more than enough. Yet close to 1 billion people suffer from food shortages and suffer from hunger. And again, this relates to the misallocation of resources, where we take grain and croplands and we use them to grow food for animals that more well-off countries eat. And it's, again, a very poor converter of calories. You get a lot less calories out of the animals than the amount of calories that are invested in the plants required to continuously breed these animals into existence, fatten them up, slaughter them, rinse, repeat, continue over and over and over again year after year. So in addition to the devastating environmental impact that this has at scale, this also has serious implications with regard to food security, water security, and any hope of addressing world hunger. And all these issues surprised me as I learned more about issues that intersect with veganism. I was vegetarian first and became vegan, and it wasn't until later that I was exposed to the environmental issues that have been reported on by the UN, by the World Bank, by Stockholm International Water Institute, by all these institutions, but just they're starting to bubble to the surface, but they really haven't yet. And then the human rights dimension. And once you put it all together, I think there's a compelling case to really rethink our relationship with non-human animals and really to consider the implications of our food choices and our consumption choices generally. It's not just about food. And there's a lot of resources out there. Our nonprofit website is meetyourfuture.com, MEAT, meetyourfuture.com, and we actually have a link section there with more resources. And I think once you start going through that, you'll find, if it's a new topic for you, you'll find that there's a lot of different resources to help fill in the pieces, since I wasn't able certainly to cover everything from a vegan basics perspective. But there's websites, like I mentioned before, pcrm.org and vegankit.com, which have wonderful resources for those who have some questions or are thinking about transitioning to plant-based vegan eating or vegan lifestyle. It's a little bit of a transition if you're not used to it, but just from the other side of it, and most of us were not born vegan. We were part of the same normal culture and society as anybody else, and we've made the transition. I can tell you from the other side, it is really easy to eat vegan. It's easy to find non-leather shoes. You got to find some new habits, but it's easy enough. And one of the other ways you can continue to familiarize yourself with these issues is to tune in every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Here on KPFT. But until then, good night. Thank you so much for tuning in, and take care.